Dr. Simon Clarke is currently the director of the Core General Educational Program and Associate Professor of Philosophy at the Asian University of Women in Bangladesh. He studied at the University of Auckland in New Zealand and received his doctorate from Oxford University. He has also taught at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand and here at the American University of Armenia. He is the author of Foundations and Freedom, Welfare-Based Arguments Against Paternalism, and his articles have been published in numerous journals, including Journal of Political Philosophy, Political Studies, Ethical Perspectives, etc. I invite you to start your presentation, Dr. Clarke.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming along to this conference. And greetings to all the AUA students. Yeah, I was faculty member at AUA for 6 years until 2020 and had a very, very interesting time and rewarding time there. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about in this time is my interest in exploring what the role of trust is in politics, and particularly in political theory. So trust between people and their governments has kind of been declining for the past several decades. Most societies, it's different for different societies, but in most societies, when surveys are done asking people how much they trust politicians, how much they trust the institutions of government, those levels seem to be decreasing ever since the 1950s, 1960s in most societies. So this raised questions with me that I've been trying to answer. Does it matter if people trust their government, and if so, why? And what are the kinds of reasons why people trust and distrust their governments? Okay, so I'm going to start with what I've got at the top there is what I call the trust challenge. This is kind of, to ask the question, well, why should we be interested in trust in government? Why does it matter at all? So, I mean, if a government is ruling well and making good decisions, and policies are working well for the country, then even if the people don't trust what it's doing very much, why does it matter? And if it's doing a good job, then why does it matter whether there is a trust problem or not? Okay, and that leads to two other questions, which I've got there on the screen. So yeah, and I think this is a political question, political theory, but also a practical question as well. When I think about this question, I do think about my experience in Armenia. So I was there during the years of the old regime, and then there during the Velvet Revolution as well. My impression sometimes with the old regime is that sometimes it was doing good things for the Armenian economy, doing some good things, but the people didn't really trust it, and the government didn't really sort of understand why people didn't trust it, and didn't really sort of care that much about whether people were trusting it or not. It just, I remember having contact and conversations with several members of the old regime, and they were sort of talking about, well, why are these people protesting against us? We're doing a good job in our policies and our government. They didn't seem to sort of accept that or think about this question, whether trust matters at all. Okay, so those are my two questions, or two sets of questions. Is it important that people trust the government, and if so, why? And then whether people do trust their governments, and what are the kinds of factors that play into that, whether people trust or don't trust their governments. And I'm going to say something about both of these sets of questions. Let me first start with just a very general definition, what I mean by trust, from people to the government, or trust in general. So I take it that trust is an attitude that person X or group agent X may have towards Y, characterized by two main beliefs. Firstly, there's a belief in the good intentions of person Y. Without this belief, there may be reliance on that other person, but not trust. But also a belief in the fairly competent ability of Y. Without that, there might be a desire to trust Y, but X might not actually be able to trust them if they can't accept that the person has the ability to do whatever it is that they're hoping to do. All right, so a person can trust somebody else. People can trust other people to do their jobs if they think that they believe in the good intentions and the ability of the one trusted to do whatever it is that they're hoping to do. Okay, so that will kind of factor into my discussion, right? I mean, can people believe in the good intentions of their government, and can they believe in the ability of their government to do good things? Okay, so let me start with that first question. Is it important that people trust the government, and if so, why? And I think there are sort of three main reasons that I want to point to here, which perhaps you'll be interested in discussing more fully. Firstly, political theorists have sometimes understood trust to be a condition for the legitimate use of coercion. So every government has to use coercion. It passes laws. It has to enforce those laws by threatening punishment. Laws, of course, and policies can be about many different things, but most of them have to be backed up with some kind of use of coercion. If people don't follow the laws, don't do what government says, there's some punishment threatened. Now, coercion is usually a tricky kind of thing. We're suspicious of coercion. Coercion can affect us in various ways. Coercion can, we feel very aggrieved if we're subjected to coercion by anybody else. I mean, if a robber comes up to you and points a gun and says, "Give me your money, otherwise I'll shoot you," they're using coercion. And that's obviously a way of interacting with people that generally we don't like. We're suspicious of coercion. Okay. Now, why do we not like coercion? Coercion usually undermines people's autonomy, right? So they don't get to make choices for themselves, and affects their welfare. They feel aggrieved at being targets of coercion. But some have suggested that if there is an attitude of trust, then this undermining of people's autonomy and welfare is reduced. So if the coercion comes from somebody who's trusted, then people are less conflicted about being subjects of coercion if it comes from somebody they trust. Okay, so might think about if you're forced to give up your money to somebody, you're not going to like that. That's going to undermine your autonomy and your welfare. However, if it's a friend who somehow forces you to hand over your money to them, and it's a friend who you trust, then okay, you might still think this is an attack on my autonomy and welfare, but perhaps it reduces the impact of coercion upon you. Okay, so I think that's one explanation for why trust is important from people to the government, right? So government is imposing coercion on people. The more trust that there is, then the more acceptable or legitimate that coercion is going to be. The second explanation draws upon the political thinking of John Locke. So there was a 17th century English political thinker who made an argument that legitimate government is based on the idea of a social contract, and all members of society make a social contract to set up government, and government is legitimate only if it is the result of this kind of social contract. Now, in this contract, people entrust power to government, so long as it does a decent job of ruling, so it respects people and rules well. And if it does not, then the government forfeits people's trust and becomes illegitimate, and the people are justified in trying to do something about that government that has forfeited their trust, that has done something to betray their trust. Okay, and so there's a long tradition of thought saying that trust is central to the social contract, which regulates interactions between people and their government. Okay, so those are two fairly sort of theoretical reasons for why trust is important. The third reason is a more practical type. And trust just seems to be some kind of enabling condition. Imagine a society ruled over by government where there isn't any trust by the people towards the government. That government is not really going to be able to do much. I mean, it probably can do some things. It can rely on force to get some of its laws or some of its policies through, but no government can really rely on force alone. There just aren't enough police and resources to use this. Every government needs some degree of voluntary compliance with its commands, its laws, its policies, And so to get voluntary compliance is going to have to earn the people's trust to do what it wants, okay? So we have a kind of practical reason as well as these two theoretical reasons for why the level of trust between people and their governments is an important thing to have. Okay, so I'll be interested to hear what you think about these reasons. These are sort of three of the reasons that I think are most important for why trust is an important concept in thinking about people's relations to their government. Oh, should I? Okay, I'll keep going. Next question, let me turn to, so yeah, hopefully this is a basis for discussion. I hope you can ask me, I'd be interested to hear what you think about whether trust is important between people and their governments. Now I would want to turn to that second question or second set of questions. All right, so let's assume that some level of trust is needed between people and their governments. Then, okay, well, what are the factors that influence whether people do trust their governments? Partly this is a question of looking at societies, seeing where there is trust and when there is distrust, and what are the reasons for it. But partly I'm also asking this kind of question: what is it? When is it reasonable for people, and when is it justified, and when is it good for them to trust, and when is it unreasonable for them to trust their governments? Okay, and I've come up with a couple of, well, I'm going to suggest a couple of reasons that shapes when trust is justified or not justified. So two types of considerations. Firstly, there's considerations of substance, right? Actually, what the government does. By substance, I mean, what is the government doing? What are the kinds of things that it's doing? What are the kinds of decisions that it's making that affect people's trust and distrust? So when people believe government recognizes their interests as of intrinsic importance and gives those interests due consideration in decision making, then people, well, I think, do tend to trust governments more, and it's also reasonable. It's also a good reason for when to trust. But if people believe government is not recognizing their interests, is not counting them as somebody who matters in its decisions, then people are not going to trust, and then it's also more reasonable for them not to trust. And secondly, there's a set of substantive questions. Restrictions of freedom and restrictions of rights tend to be very important when it comes to trust between people and their government. So if government is restricting people's freedom, rights, particularly preventing people from pursuing what they believe to be their interests, even if it isn't in their interests, people are less likely to trust. So people are going to withhold their trust if government is doing things, even if government is doing things which it thinks are good and it thinks are well-grounded, if it seems to the people that those things are preventing them from pursuing what they believe to be in their interests, then people are going to withhold their trust and probably are justified in doing so, even if the government has good reasons for its policies. Okay, so those two kinds of substantive reasons for that shape whether people trust or distrust their governments. But in the second type I want to mention is there also seems to be this procedural element. So even when people don't like what government has actually decided, if government has followed fair procedures in coming up with those policies, then people tend to be more likely to trust, right? So even if it's government making decisions they don't like, if that was democratically elected, if that government was democratically elected and it was a fair contest and there were, several parties campaigning and there was a real chance for different sides to win the election, then some kind of fair procedure has been followed and people are more likely to trust, even if they don't like the result, even if even if the party that they wanted didn't win. Okay, and other procedural matters are very important as well. So if people have chances to participate in the decision-making process other than the election. So governments often say, okay, we're proposing a law. Now we'll have a period of discussion and people can submit their feedback. People can submit make citizen submissions about what reasons they might have for or against that law. And maybe they can go to committees, to government committees, and talk about that law or that policy. If those opportunities exist, then people are more likely to trust the government's decision, even if they turn out to disagree with that decision. If they say, well, if I had a chance to have a say, so then they're more likely to believe that the government is taking its interests seriously. So if it allows citizen participation, if it allows due process, so it doesn't just pass policies and laws very quickly without consulting, without having several steps and letting people think about this for a bit, or without consulting experts, without consulting even the opposition government to have some due process. And finally, is it consistent in its decision? So if it passes one law, which it says is backed up by these reasons, but if the same reasons would support another law, but it says, no, we're not going to have that law, there's a failure of consistency there. And this is a kind of procedural flaw of government decision-making, right? So the more of these procedures are fulfilled, then the more likely it is that people will trust, and the more reasonable and more justified it is that they should trust, and vice versa. The less of these that are in place. So when we think about totalitarian regimes which don't have fair procedures, and authoritarian regimes that don't allow for citizen participation, then it's less justified for the people to trust what the government is doing. Okay, so putting these things together, am I okay with my time? Must be at the end of my time. I want to suggest our conclusion should be this, that the government should ensure that it maintains people's trust in order to legitimize its use of coercion, to adhere to the social contract, and to maintain its practical effectiveness. And it can do so by recognizing each person's importance, by having policies which do not prevent people pursuing what they believe are their interests, and by following fair procedures in decision-making as much as possible. Okay, but I'm sure you have thoughts, questions, things to talk about. There's just a few of the references that I've used to shape my thinking on this interesting issue.
Thank you, Dr. Clarke. Yeah, I believe it was very interesting and important presentation, also considering the context of Armenia and how the events over the past few years have affected the trust between the government and people. I see that students have many interesting questions. Let me start with this one. What is your opinion on white lies? Do you think that the use of it by the government and politicians reduces the trust of the people or makes them trust them more?
Oh, what was sorry, I didn't catch the first part. What do I think of?
Yeah, white lies.
White lies, okay. White lies, no, I think, well, white lies, well, I mean, on the first face of it, white lies will be undermining of trust. I mean, any kind of lie will undermine trust. So need to be very careful. So if it's a white lie, it's done for the people's good, then if the people realize later that it was for their good, and as long as the lie wasn't too significant and serious, then trust might be maintained. So it might be maintained. But I'd say that I have to be very careful. So the problem with doing things for people's own good is that they might not see that it's for their own good. So you might tell a white lie. You know, if I tell my wife, yes, you look fantastic in that blouse, and it's not true, it'll come back to harm me eventually. It'll undermine the trust. So white lies, even if I do it for somebody else's good, they are probably highly likely not to see it that way. And so I think white lies will be usually undermining of trust.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is, can you explain what is the main difference between trust and reliance, and how are they connected with each other?
Trust and reliance, okay, yeah. That's, I take reliance to be a little bit more sort of mechanical, to be less of a moral notion. So if I get into a taxi and say, okay, taxi driver, take me to such and such a place, as long as I know he's a good driver, right, and will drive the car in the right direction in a timely manner, then I can rely on the taxi driver to get me there. But I don't think I've fully gone all the way to trust in the taxi driver. If I've got no idea who he is, I mean, I just think, okay, well, if he wants my money, he's going to drive the car in the direction and where I want to go. And so I rely on him. But trust has more of a moral notion, a belief in the good intention. So when I ask my friend to drive me somewhere, and I know they have a good ability, and they also care about me, they want to make sure I get to where I want to go, then I trust my friend to take me there. But I don't trust the taxi driver to take me there. I rely on the taxi driver.
Okay, thank you. The next question is about the first part of your presentation about this background. It says, do you contend that trust levels in the realm of politics have ever been high? Could Machiavelli's The Prince be considered a vivid illustration of political distrust management, offering insight into enduring themes of governance and power dynamics?
Wow, okay, great question. Excellent question. Yes. I haven't thought about it like that, but yes, I could see how you can think of Machiavelli's The Prince as a way of managing distrust. Yeah, managing distrust in a very Machiavellian way, using it very much to sort of maintain and maximize power. Have there been high levels of trust? It seems there were. If we look at Western societies in the up to the 1950s, sort of 20th century to the 1950s, and USA, Western Europe did seem to report fairly high levels of trust from the people towards their governments. I don't know why. Perhaps they were a little bit misled. Perhaps they were a little bit brainwashed. Perhaps institutions were better, or I think politicians behaved a little bit better in the earlier in many of these societies, of course, with exceptions. But there did seem to be higher levels of trust, especially in 1950s, 1960s, and then from the 70s, it starts declining. So sometimes trust was higher. I don't know about other historical eras. So, I mean, de Tocqueville went to America, USA in the 19th century, and he seemed to find that people were generally pretty happy in America with their government. So perhaps levels of trust were high at that time. And well, the question is, how do some societies manage to maintain higher levels of trust in their government than others?
Thank you. So another interesting question is, to what extent do economic factors such as income inequality and unemployment impact the levels of trust in governance, and what policies do you consider to be implemented to address these kind of challenges?
Okay, well, very interesting. That's a good question too. Well, I think a competent ability to handle the economy will definitely factor into trust. So if government makes mistakes, you think about the UK 2 years ago when they suddenly had a whole range of policies which brought about a mini crash in the economy for a short time. This kind of showed not a very competent understanding of the economy, and so people's trust in the party that's still in power in the UK now, the Conservative Party, people's trust declined sharply at that time. So I think a competent ability to manage the economy, looking at interest rates, unemployment, GDP growth, all of those usual indicators do seem to be factors that play a role in people's trust. But the inequality one is an interesting one. There's some evidence that the more inequality there is, the less trust there is. That inequality is undermining of trust levels. If the government can do some policies to rectify inequality to some extent, that could help improve trust levels. But I think the evidence is a bit unclear. I mean, it doesn't seem to be a major trust factor. When I look at these things, look at these kind of things, it seems that, hang on, let me bring up this inequality. I mean, surveys asking people what kinds of political policies affect their trust in government. equality and inequality is there somewhere, but freedom and rights and procedural matters seem to be higher. If you actually look at the surveys, people say, well, okay, they're not so worried by inequalities and policies regarding inequality. It's their freedom and their rights and procedural fairness that play a bigger role influencing people's trust levels.
Okay. Thank you very much